There are buildings that symbolize France, castles that once sheltered state treasures. They've existed for centuries and are known worldwide. Versailles, the Louvre, the Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Vincennes, and Chambord. But a singular event would change everything, World War II. Faced with the German occupation, Nazi pillaging and bombings, they could have disappeared forever. The greatest works of art, such as the Mona Lisa, Liberty Leading the People, the Raft of the Medusa, the Venus de Milo, and the Winged Victory of Samothrace were all nearly reduced to ashes.
Remembering the castles under occupation was taboo.
Their modern custodians look back on the dark times of their predecessors. Hitler wanted to pillage Europe for his own massive museum.
Hitler hated Versailles.
How did these great French castles face the Nazi invasion?
You obviously had to prepare for immediate occupation.
How did they protect their treasures? Who was involved in secret networks to save the French heritage?
It was a symbolic form of resistance.
Just how were these stone murals, tapestries, precious wooden pieces, marble sculptures, and majestic stairways secretly saved from annihilation? Women and men joined the resistance. They stood firm to save the most prestigious castles from destruction. World War I had just ended, and Europe was trying to rebuild. Yet in Germany, a new political force was rising, Nazism. Rallied by Hitler, Göring, and Goebbels, the Nazis wanted revenge for their country's defeat. After their rise to power in 1933, they prioritized building and rearming their military. Soon they'd be off to conquer Europe. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France was next on the list. The great castles of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Vincennes, Chambord were symbols to be destroyed, and Versailles was the first target.
The Chateau of Versailles is significant in Germany's history because in January 1871, it was in the Hall of Mirrors that Wilhelm I was crowned the Emperor of Germany. That was the foundation of Germany's Second Reich, a key historical moment.
It was an insult to France. It was humiliating. The war in 1914 was seen as an act of retribution. Retribution that was actually pretty explicit, when Clemenceau decided to sign the peace treaty in this very room in 1919. All the people who were to witness that moment recall the humiliation of the Germans. They were the last ones to enter the Hall of Mirrors to sign the treaty, and they had tears in their eyes. These two events were obviously connected and played a key role in political thinking at the start of World War II.
The French saw Versailles not only as the masterpiece of Louis XIV or a royal palace, but also as the residence of presidents. The Congress chamber was built explicitly to establish the French Third Republic. On April 5, 1939, Albert Lebrun was re-elected president of the Republic, while the rest of Europe prepared for another war. He didn't know it then, but he'd be the Third Republic's last president.
In 1933, before the war had even started, when whispers of another world war were just beginning to circulate, a secret plan was put into place to prioritize, protect, and evacuate the most important works of art.
Pressure from Hitler intensified after he invaded Austria. In September 1938, he claimed the Sudets, part of Czechoslovakia. Europe was on the brink of war. The Munich Agreement on September 29th and 30th finally ended the crisis.
They started filling crates when the Munich crisis happened, with a view to protecting and taking them out of Versailles and even the greater Paris area.
I can only imagine how awful it must have been to think that a castle might be destroyed.
The war in Spain from 1936 to 1939 proved historic villages and monuments were targets. Bombings, explosions, fires. The destruction was widespread. Not to mention the threat of Hitler's outrageous project to build his own museum filled with Europe's stolen treasures.
Hitler had a special team whose job it was to collect as much art as possible, above all paintings, because his big idea was to build his own museum that would serve as, quote-unquote, a trophy case for his military achievements, to be put on display for the German public.
The Linz Art Gallery, this great museum planned by the Führer, was designed to hold all of the greatest artwork gleaned around occupied Europe.
What could be done to stop it? A man named Jacques Jaujard took the lead. He had helped evacuate the Prado Museum in Madrid during the Spanish Civil War. As assistant director of national museums, he came up with a secret plan to save the greatest French masterpieces.
Jaujard's plan was put into place rather early on. While some would say that Jaujard was a pessimist, he correctly predicted the invasion of the German army in advance. The goal of the plan was to protect the art.
I can't even imagine what it was like for those who had to go through the task of selecting the art in question. It must be excruciating to decide which pieces to protect.
We know there were about 3,600 paintings that left the Louvre during the evacuation.
About 3,600 of the most precious pieces escaped out of the tens of thousands kept at the Louvre. 5,546 crates were shipped out by Parisian museums for safekeeping, and over 45,000 works of art were moved around France during the Second World War. But many still remained in the castles.
They tried to protect as much as they could. They moved many pieces underground into the tunnels beneath the Château de Versailles and others to the Orangerie. They wanted to be prepared.
Everything that could go, including the wood paneling, was taken down, wrapped, and sent away, notably to Trianon, leaving the castle like an empty shell in case of German military invasion.
They had to work very, very quickly. And at the end, the usual methods for conservation were not considered at all. All staff just grabbed whatever sculpture or great work of art they could, including historic masterpieces.
Today we ship works of art in very special humidity-controlled crates. We do everything we can to protect the art that travels, for example, for exhibitions. But back then, everything was put into boxes and packed hastily, just to get it out the door.
The evacuation succeeded because it was cleverly planned out, spearheaded by Jaujard. It was completely out of the question to put the name of a piece on a box for fear of it being stolen or pillaged. There was, however, a color code used to label the crates so as to hint at their content. For example, there were yellow labels, green labels, and for the pieces of utmost importance, red labels.
In addition to the color code, they painted 2 letters and a number on every crate. The first letter represented the place of origin, for example, an L for the Louvre. The second letter was for the nature of the work. If it was a painting, it was a P. Finally, the number graded the importance. For example, the Mona Lisa was LP0, which meant Louvre, painting, and the highest level of priority. 0 meant a top priority masterpiece.
The Louvre did not have a huge staff, so they enlisted La Samaritaine, a big department store that lent its trucks and staff to help the Louvre accomplish this massive task.
Nothing was easy about this move, and the conservators often ran into problems along the way. How could they transport these paintings if they couldn't roll them up, since they were too fragile? And how would they move the largest pieces, precious frames and sculptures?
The Comédie Française, which was just next door, also lent the Louvre its trucks, which typically transported theater decor across the country to help move the art.
Sometimes the challenge was considerable. Consider the winged Victory of Samothrace. It's over 5 meters tall. How on earth would they move this monumental piece?
The Louvre team created a ramp And after removing the massive statue from its base, they laid down 3 wooden planks on which they gently slid it, carefully bringing it down the Daru staircase, 1 step at a time. It was truly a sight to behold, and everyone was holding their breath, trying not to imagine this great world treasure smashing into 1,000 pieces. It was then packed into what was a custom-built crate for protection and transport.
After several days of back-breaking work, the trucks were ready to leave the Louvre and Versailles. They gathered at the loading dock. It would take 51 convoys to transport everything.
They also had to plan where everything would go and would be stored.
For their first stop, the truck drivers were instructed to head to the Château de Chambord. The castle would serve as the first place of refuge for the most precious items in the collection. Chambord was chosen because it belonged to the French Republic, who had bought it back from the Bourbon-Parme family in 1930. It was not open to the public and had no role to play in the wake of the war. It was empty, vast, and far from the border, 3 essential characteristics.
The Château de Chambord was chosen mostly because it was away from any big city, so at low risk of being bombed.
At the time, the chateau was basically empty. The walls were made of stone, so it had very little chance of collapsing, caving in, or catching fire.
It's an extremely big chateau, which features very tall, wide door frames that allowed even the largest and most important pieces of art, like, for example, the raft of the Medusa, to pass rather easily.
That's how we were able to protect the armistice desk and Marie Antoinette's jewel cabinet. Everything that could be taken out and moved was taken out and moved.
September 1939. At that very moment, the Germans invaded Poland. Tanks descended on the country and Warsaw disappeared beneath the bombs. As the Second World War erupted, the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye prepared for the worst.
The castle has housed the Museum of National Antiquities since 1862. In the wake of World War II, it already had a significant collection. Our archives contain a number of packing slips that clearly document that there were crates of archaeological artifacts that were transferred to the Château de Chambord for protection.
At the Château de Vincennes, less attention was paid to artistic considerations, even though the chapel's stained glass windows were set aside. The military took center stage. They'd been maintaining this space ever since the monarchy.
When you enter the castle, you can tell right away that it's a military space. It served as barracks, so they needed space to store all sorts of equipment. The keep was completely surrounded by bastions on all sides, meaning that the section from the King's Pavilion all the way to the Tower of Paris was unsegmented. They even sealed the gaps of the keep to create space for various maneuvers and circulation within the castle.
The custodian of the Château de Vincennes, its greatest advocate, was a civilian. His name was André Urtret, a painter and prolific speaker who knew everything about the castle. He sought recognition for this monument, often overshadowed by the military presence.
André Urtret was a Vincennes enthusiast. He was self-taught. He was born and raised in Vincennes and became passionate about the castle. This led him to create what we refer to as the historical museum inside the castle. He refused to see the keep as a military station, thinking instead it was the most beautiful keep in all of Europe. He was allowed to open his museum in 1934, and naturally, he became its custodian.
In 1939, the other main figure in Vincennes was World War I hero General Gamelin, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the French Armed Forces. He decided to move their headquarters to Vincennes, but without installing a phone line to avoid leaks.
General Gamelin, in August 1939, combined 2 roles. One as the Chief of Staff of National Defense, and one as Commander of Land Forces, which brought him into the GQG, the French Army headquarters. At that time, the government was in Paris and the GQG was at La Ferté-sur-Joie. Gamelin, who refused to choose between the 2 positions, took up residence in the middle. That gave the Château de Vincennes a rather surprising role in the eruption of World War II.
On May 10, 1940, the Germans began their march on the Western Front. In a matter of weeks, they would decimate everything. Without Jojard's plan, the art would have been lost. A new chapter was beginning.
For the Germans, it wasn't obvious from the start that they'd get to Paris in 6 weeks.
The Germans were 200 kilometers away, then 100 kilometers, then just a car ride away.
When the Germans arrived in June 1940, general panic ensued.
Everyone fled. Civilians in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, but also the military in Vincennes.
The castle was evacuated very quickly. Once the assault began, General Gamelin, soon after replaced by General Weygand, started tracking the German troops' progress on a day-to-day basis. And at some point, the reality set in for him. Strategizing was futile. He got in his truck, grabbed his officers, and quickly headed south. The exodus and the panic happened simultaneously. Of the 20,000 inhabitants in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, only about 5,000 remained by June 15th. Unsurprisingly, the castle's last occupants followed suit and fled as well. Anyone could have come up to the castle and just taken it. The palace was totally abandoned for a few days. Those were the most dramatic moments in the 20th century history of Saint-Germain-en-Laye.
As war erupted, no one was protecting the chateau. They were left to face the enemy on their own. What was to become of these monuments of national heritage?
In Versailles, one man stood his ground, Pierre Ladoué, a World War I veteran who became curator of the Château de Versailles in 1938. He dreaded the confrontation with the Germans. With his 3 gardeners, he was the last one guarding the enormous chateau grounds.
Ladoué deserves a lot of credit. He was up against the entire German army. When the Germans took Versailles on June 14, 1940, he was practically alone in the castle, and he was there, you could say, to welcome the Germans, and at least ensure they didn't destroy everything.
Pierre Ladoué met the first 2 German soldiers at the castle's front gate. They were the first of thousands to come. The atmosphere was incredibly gloomy, as that same morning, the Satory military gunpowder reserves had exploded, and the air was thick with dust. The mood was dismal. It was dark out in the middle of the day. The Germans then hung their red flag with a black swastika in the middle of the chateau. Hanging their flag in Versailles was their way of saying that the embarrassment of 1919 was finally over, and that, in a way, the status of the premises was back to what it had been in 1871.
The Germans saw Vincennes the same way that the French military leaders did, meaning as a spacious and secure base very close to Paris. It's estimated that there were between 5,000 and 15,000 German troops at the Château de Vincennes.
I think there must have been an overwhelming feeling of solitude. The loneliness that comes with knowing you have to make decisions very quickly and that you cannot afford to hesitate while making them. They needed to move forward without knowing where they were going or how long this war would last. At first they thought it would be over quickly, but it lasted a long time.
France was occupied. The Germans had powerful control over the country by the end of June 1940. On June 28th, Hitler went to Paris. It was his way of celebrating the anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on the same day in 1919. 21 years later, he visited the great monuments conquered by the German army. He wanted to dig deeper and study French art so he could better destroy it.
Adolf Hitler had twice been denied admission to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He thought of himself as an artist and had strong opinions about what constituted art.
Nazi Germany had begun stealing art on its own territory in 1933. Now it was France's turn. Hitler's men stored the art stolen from French Jews at the Galerie Nationale du Jeu de Paume before sending it to Germany.
Göring had a phenomenal collection of paintings. He was the master of the Jeu de Paume Museum. Overall, he visited over 21 times, pretty much picking and choosing what he wanted for himself from all the art that we know was stolen from Jewish families and stockpiled there. On November 3, 1940, Göring asked to be privately shown a piece called The Beautiful German Woman, a superb 16th century Lindenwood sculpture by Gregor Erhardt. Göring had fallen in love with it, and he would stop at nothing until he had it as part of his private collection.
The Nazi threat was real, just as Joja had suspected. By the time the German attack began, most French masterpieces had already moved to Chambord, where they'd be safe.
Chambord must have been a maze. The convoys each had 7 or 8 trucks, and each one of them had to be emptied, stocked, and inventoried. The staff on site had to deal with all of that.
Someone needed to hold the reins at Chambord, which ended up becoming the greatest art repository of the Second World War. To that end, Jacques Joja chose Pierre Chomeur. The duo had already worked together to save Madrid's Prado Museum as well as during the Munich crisis evacuations. But this time, Chomeur had a huge responsibility, protecting the collections from the greatest French museums, day in and day out.
Pierre Chomeur came up with a zoning plan to break down the castle into specific sections using the National Museum's archives, which held the master plans for Chambord. The artwork from the Château de Vincennes was primarily stored in 2 rooms on the ground floor. The pieces from Versailles were mostly stored in the chapel, and those from Saint-Germain-en-Laye were stored on the first floor, surrounding a ceramic stove that had belonged to the Marshal of Saxe near the main stairwell. Chambord had no basement, as it was built on wetlands. So while the foundation was solid, it wasn't possible to have basements. There was no elevator, since they couldn't install the shafts anywhere, so they were limited by the size of the crates. The biggest crates were automatically stored on the ground floor. Then, when more crates started showing up, they had permission from the museums to take the crates apart and rebuild them slightly smaller, so they'd pass through the doorways. Towards the end, they played musical chairs with some of the pieces, putting them wherever they would fit. But some pieces spent the entire war in the same spot, like the pastel of Madame de Pompadour by Quentin Latour, which was stored in a cross on the second floor.
The German occupation was formalized by the Treaty of June 22, 1940, signed on Marshal Pétain's request. Versailles, le Louvre, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and Vincennes were already in the hands of the Germans. As part of Joja's plan, Chambord would escape the enemy's reach. However, the treaty drew a line between the north of France, that was under German occupation, and the south, governed by the French state from the capital of Vichy.
The Château de Chambord was about 40 kilometers from the border, just within the occupied zone.
The famous photo of the German soldier taking up his post in front of the Château de Chambord is symbolic, because that was the moment they found everything that had been stockpiled there. It explains why Chambord needed to be protected, because from that moment on, the French relinquished their responsibility, hence the German presence.
Now that Chambord was in the hands of the Germans, what was to become of the thousands of pieces of art stored there? The greatest of them risked being stolen from France. The curators therefore secretly started moving certain pieces. The most famous of them all was already gone by the time the Germans arrived.
The Mona Lisa was such an object of fantasy that copies were made and distributed during the war, and even the Germans got caught up trying to buy or find them.
As a matter of fact, the Germans really could have demanded the Mona Lisa at any time, as it would have been such an iconic piece for the walls of their Linz museum. That's why the Mona Lisa's crate had 3 red stickers. The curators knew it was of utmost importance that this masterpiece, one of mankind's greatest works, was kept safe. As it turns out, the Mona Lisa's wanderings would follow the course of the Second World War. It left the Louvre on August 23, 1939. The painting first went to Chambord and then found refuge in the castle of Louvigny until it was sent to the Loc-Dieu Abbey in Aveyron in June 1940. It was then sent to the Ingres Museum in Montauban, but the humidity there was too high, so it moved again, this time to the Château de Montal.
With something as precious as the Mona Lisa, one would think it would be kept in a safe. It wasn't so. At Chambord, in the heart of the chapel, it was simply placed in a closet. At one point, Pierre Chaumer was so worried about it that he hid the Mona Lisa in its crate under his bed. Another time, Lucie Mazuric, who is a curator at the Louvre and who accompanied the piece on its journey to Montauban, also hid it under her bed for fear of it being stolen. And although the German occupation became increasingly intense, the Mona Lisa was safe.
In certain cities, the German occupation was strong, and its brutal grip had a powerful impact on certain chateaux, like Saint-Germain-en-Laye.
The chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was not just any chateau. It suffered a terrible shock. That's where the most ancient collections of prehistoric and Gallic art were kept, the essence of French identity. But in June 1940, the Germans hung their swastika flag on the front of the chateau, causing a shocking identity crisis. How could the chateau fight back? The curators needed some way to resist the occupiers.
They had to prepare for immediate occupation. Saint-Germain-en-Laye is built around the castle, and it became the most occupied city in France. 15,000 to 20,000 Germans, officers and troops, were up against 15,000 to 20,000 Frenchmen.
For the German administration, it was the ideal place to regroup and consolidate certain services, which were important mostly for managing and controlling France, but also for governing and managing the region. This caused plenty of housing problems.
The Germans loved beautiful villas. And there were some gorgeous villas in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. This cohabitation led to a terrible situation for the locals, because French middle-class families in Saint-Germain-en-Laye often had the first and second floors of their homes occupied by the Germans.
The Chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was in the heart of occupied France, just like Vincennes and Versailles. What were they going to do?
Our curators were constantly inventing ways to resist the Germans, who became increasingly demanding.
In Vincennes, André Urtré, who was not a soldier, began negotiating with the Germans to keep them from damaging the castle during the occupation. He did everything he could to make them understand the significance of their actions. Raymond Lantier became the director of the museum in Saint-Germain, so it fell on him to deal with the escalating danger and the ever-increasing risk of full occupation. We know he negotiated site visits at first, until eventually the army insisted on a more significant on-site presence.
At the Louvre, Jacques Jaujard had to really put on an act in front of the occupiers to hide the fact that this enormous museum had been emptied of its treasures.
When the Germans arrived at the Louvre, they were only shown copies. Castings of the statues had been made to hide their true absence. This was the case for the Venus de Milo.
The Germans were allowed to visit the Louvre for free, while the French had to pay 1 franc. It added insult to injury that we had to pay for entry to our own museum, while the occupying forces could visit at no cost whatsoever.
The Germans in Versailles were no ordinary tourists. Pierre Ladouet, the curator of the chateau, tried to set opening hours, but troops regularly demanded tours, and he was forced to obey.
Pierre Ladouet would say that it was as if all the troops had been given an order to visit the castle when passing through Versailles, because they all came. A never-ending flow of German soldiers, of the Wehrmacht, came to visit the Château de Versailles.
From 1941 onwards, the curator just focused on protecting a small section, with a few items exclusively for French visitors, while the German soldiers were taken on separate, exclusive tours of the grands appartements.
The minute the Germans stepped foot inside, there was damage and theft. Paintings and canvases were torn and punctured. Relics were taken. The castle was essentially pillaged. Obviously, this led to a very real feeling of intimate violation, of deprivation, not to mention a sort of alienation.
In Versailles, the chapel where Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette were married now had new accents echoing off its walls.
The chapel of the castle was used throughout the war by German soldiers, sometimes for Mass, but also for all sorts of concerts and performances, often exclusively for the occupying German troops. There was also, at times, a sort of childish behavior, where, for example, a soldier would ask the curator where the 1919 Treaty of Versailles had been signed. The curator would point to a spot, and the soldier would walk over and slam his boot down, symbolically crushing the space where the Germans had once been humiliated.
They did whatever they wanted. For example, there are pools like the Pièce d'eau des Suisses where the Germans would bathe, which was strictly forbidden. They put up large signs in German to remind them that it was against the rules, but the rules meant nothing to them.
That was how life under the occupation was organized.
Nothing was simple in a country that was divided in two. The state was run in Vichy by Marshal Pétain, who headed the entire administration. Why not move closer to the other government ministries that were still in Paris and set up in Versailles?
The Germans had said to the government in Vichy that Versailles would be declared a free city if Marshal Pétain moved there.
Charles Maréchal-Beaupré loved the idea and took the concept so far as to hang an enormous portrait of Marshal Pétain in the middle of the chateau. This clever act got him recognized and also put him in good grace with the Vichy regime, which continued to support him financially.
Pétain said he would never move to the Château de Versailles. He said he would feel oppressed, even imprisoned, by the German troops there.
And so it was decided they wouldn't go to Versailles, and as a result, the budget was cut and hard times began.
How would they maintain such splendor on a limited budget? The chateau's curator cut spending down to only the most essential.
The castle was neglected. It had no chance of being restored and no budget for maintenance. The art kept there deteriorated. Ceilings began to sag and in some cases even crumble.
People who visited the palace during this time thought it resembled a farmhouse. Goebbels said the gallery looked like a barn. That's how bad it was. The windows had been covered with wood paneling and sandbags. I think the caretakers at Versailles did what they could with what they had, but they couldn't do it all. There were things that happened that we'd consider ludicrous today. The skylight of Gallery of Battles was painted blue to avoid being bombed.
The Grand Canal was drained so that planes couldn't use it to direct themselves towards Paris. The groves were not pruned and the sculptures were removed from their pedestals. The garden in Versailles fell into disrepair during the occupation.
Already weakened by a lack of funding, the chateaux were also threatened by Allied planes targeting German installations.
The threat came from the sky. The Germans set up anti-aircraft guns here in the heart of the chateau. And in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the curator, Raymond Lantier, wrote a letter to Jacques Jaujat to express his concern about the bombings.
On Tuesday, March 3, 1942, from 9:15 to 11:30 p.m., the city of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was the target of an airstrike that damaged the Museum of National Antiquities. While no specific work of art was harmed, almost all the windows on the north and east sides of the building were blown off. Most of the damage seems to have been caused by cluster bombs that were dropped around 9:30 p.m. on the lawn, merely 250 to 300 meters from the castle. Signed, Raymond Lantier. As time passed, especially after the English bombing on March 3, 1942, the castle was increasingly militarized.
Starting with the first airstrikes in 1942, Saint-Germain-en-Laye also became a target for the Allies.
In addition to the 1942 English airstrikes, because they dropped from 3,000 meters, the American bombs meant that the palace could be hit even when the targets were the nearby Achères train station or the Sartrouville Bridge.
It was around this time that great bunkers were built, where people took refuge and basically abandoned any and all previous facilities.
The bunkers were built the moment the bombs began to fall, when things were at their worst, from September 1943 to June 1944. That's really when bunkers became useful. As one of France's most fortified cities, it was full of bunkers. It featured a wall of bunkers, notably that of von Rundstedt.
There were 18 bunkers like this one in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. It was 3 stories high and played a special role. That's where the German High Command operated under von Rundstedt, who was running all of Western Europe from the Netherlands to Norway. This bunker had an autonomous power supply and extremely advanced communication systems. Dozens of men could survive in here for weeks.
From the safety of their bunkers, the Germans sought full collaboration from the French authorities. On the art front, Abel Bonnard, known to the French as La Gestapette because of his pro-Nazi activism, was thrown into the limelight.
Abel Bonnard was the Minister of National Education from 1942 to 1944, and he was a notorious Nazi collaborator. He did whatever he could to serve the Germans, notably through public education and in the fine arts, sometimes even going above and beyond the actual German demands.
Jacques Jaujat was under Abel Bonnard's supervision, but it quickly became obvious to all the parties involved that Jaujat would not be swayed.
Jacques Jaujat didn't trust Abel Bonnard. There was one situation that really highlighted the curator's efforts to resist the Nazis' attempts to steal the French pieces of art. The Basel altar is a gold church altarpiece encrusted with precious stones that dates from the Middle Ages. It had been kept at Chambord during the war, and Marshal Göring knew it was there. It's a truly exceptional work of art, and he immediately asked Abel Bonnard to send it to him in Germany. Chaumet and Jaujat didn't want to cooperate, because they knew that if the piece left Chambord, it would leave France as well. Finally, when they couldn't stall any longer, and after much insistence from Göring and their minister, they packed it up and sent it to Paris. But they created mountains of administrative hurdles to keep the piece in France.
Saving France's heritage would require time. Meanwhile, the chateau's staff would also take part in the resistance through secret networks.
Curators had meetings in Paris during the war in the presence of the Germans. And before or after these meetings, from about 1943 to 1944, they would pass bits of helpful information to each other in service of the resistance.
Jacques Jaujat was part of the Samson network. It was a very large resistance network that covered the entire territory and included people from a mix of social classes. Jaujat's wife, Jeanne Boitel, an actress, was also part of the network. Someone like Pierre Chaumet couldn't have been unaware of Jaujat's role in the resistance.
Charles Morisot-Beaupré worked for the resistance by hiding French officers. His son, Jean Morisot-Beaupré, was also part of the resistance, and he worked to transmit some highly sensitive German documents. In February 1943, a black sedan stopped in front of their house. Gestapo agents got out of the car. They were looking for Jean, who luckily was not home at the time, but they searched the house and interrogated the family.
While the Gestapo were trying to arrest Jean Morisot-Beaupré at his parents' house in Versailles, he was actually hiding at Jacques Jaujat's residence, since both were part of the Samson network.
We remember the heroes, but let's not forget all the others that helped. The many small hands that often kept the crates moving. Everyone who shared information. Those were the people who helped the heroes, the curators who knew the art reserves better than anyone, to get information to the resistance and its fighters, and even to the Allies, essentially starting in the summer of 1944.
There were a dozen watchmen who constantly did rounds day and night.
Museum staff was not content to simply fight off potential theft by the Germans. They also took it upon themselves day in and day out to protect the art from any harm.
They had to conduct surveys, open the crates, and check if the paintings were not being destroyed by humidity or even fire, which could easily start in any one of these chateaux. Chambord was actually chosen as a safe haven because it was built of dressed stone, so it had a lower risk of fire.
A large number of fire extinguishers were purchased in Paris to equip Chambord, and the Louvre and Versailles also sent a collection of water pumps to Chambord. On site, staff had rigorous daily training sessions, so they could learn to use these water pumps and the various fire extinguishers in case there was an emergency.
Every day was a fire hazard. In 1944, Allied airstrikes intensified. Fear of being bombed became an increasing concern. Flyovers at Chambord were a constant threat.
A plane that was sent from England to drop bombs on France got lost, and eventually it ran out of fuel. The pilots said they saw something large and white through the trees, and only realized it was Chambord as they parachuted out.
The falling plane missed the palace by an inch before crashing a few meters away on the front lawn.
Pierre Chaumer sent a letter with a postcard where he drew out the plane's trajectory.
Chambord, June 23, 1944. Dear Mr. National Museum Director, I wrote to you yesterday in the heat of the moment. This morning, after new and meticulous examination, I confirmed that no parts of the castle or any of its surrounding structures were damaged. It's a miracle. The attached postcard shows the trajectory of the distraught British plane, which nearly came down on a rooftop. Had it hit the terrace, it would have been the end of Chambord as we know it. Yours, Pierre Chaumer.
The greatest national works and some of humanity's greatest works were in that building. One could say it would have been the end of the world.
The pilot was retrieved by members of the resistance at Chambord and sent back to England. The chateau's staff no longer hesitated to take action. This opened a new and perilous chapter of French history.
The resistance at Chambord was not just a question of heritage. It was also about saving people, people passing through the gardens, and who worked with the Maquis fighters.
The Château de Chambord, and above all the castle's park, became an important part of the French resistance, especially when the Germans re-established compulsory work service, leading to the rise of the Maquis in France in February 1943. Hundreds, if not thousands of young people, who were often alerted by the local police, fled to escape doing mandatory work for the Germans and went into hiding in the forest of Chambord. But the Germans didn't come after the runaways right away. They first went after their families.
Two things were happening. The Germans were getting weak, and on the other hand, the resistance was growing quickly and becoming more and more active, with over 300 networks that mobilized the people and irritated the Germans.
The fighters needed a place to hide and were obviously in support of preserving and saving France's national heritage. Since castles are typically situated off the main roads, it made perfect sense for them to go the back way, meaning towards the castles and through their gardens.
The German troops received new orders. They were to crush any sign of resistance. Any terrorist act could be retaliated against. And they had to strike back with cruelty to crush any glimmer of rebellion in the people. The peace at Chambord was shattered when resistance fighters decided to meet on the premises to launch an attack on troops moving from the south towards Paris.
In August 1944, the Germans were running against the clock to get across the other side of the Loire River.
German troops were crossing the chateau's gardens and were attacked by the resistance, and a German soldier was killed. The soldier's body was immediately taken to the center of the village.
It was a critical moment. The Nazi troops were instructed to capture and hold hostage some of the inhabitants. Their leader, Major Layer, was convinced that burning the castle down would be the perfect way to punish the resistance, calm the French forces of the interior, and terrorize the people that could possibly be harboring resistance members.
Having surrounded the village, the Germans started setting fire to certain homes and grabbing people at gunpoint. Some villagers sought refuge in the chateau. Pierre Chaumer threw open the doors and welcomed them into the yard.
Leye was convinced that the crates he saw at the castles contained weapons. It took Chambord at least 30 minutes to convince him that the crates actually contained works of art, not weapons of any kind. Leye opened some of the crates to be sure, and ultimately decided to not burn the castle down. He did, however, punish the village by killing 12 hostages.
He gave the hostages an order to walk out of the chateau's front door, the one just behind me. And while they were walking, as they approached the stables, they were slaughtered. Their bodies were then thrown into the manure on the other side of the stables.
The Germans hastily retreated because the Allies had the advantage after the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, and the Battle of Normandy. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS troops began to move farther east. This meant large forces were passing through the Parisian region as they withdrew. The role of Vincennes in the resistance began to grow even more.
Things were really strained in the summer of 1944. First, the Germans were desperate. Second, the people in Vincennes and in the regions of the east of Paris became bolder and more involved in resistance operations and in their support for the armed resistance. On August 19th, the entire German garrison was replaced by SS troops.
The Waffen-SS troops in 1944 were teenagers. Some of the soldiers were 17, 18, or 19 years old, who knew nothing but the Nazi regime, so they were fully committed to the cause.
They arrived with prisoners they had captured at the police precinct of the 12th arrondissement in Paris, and they locked them up.
The question was, what do we do with all these prisoners? Setting them free was a risk from the Germans' point of view, so the only solution they saw was, tragically, to kill them all.
They'd take a hostage, shoot him, take a second hostage, shoot him, take a third hostage. They forced the survivors to remove the bodies.
We can only imagine the SS troops shouting at these poor souls as they were forced to carry bodies down the spiral staircase of the Devil's Tower to the ditches below. The bodies were then buried in the very ditches that had just been dug by the prisoners themselves.
The Germans had committed a massacre. But just 10 kilometers from the Château de Vincennes, in the center of Paris, the contrast was striking. The liberation of August 24th and 25th, 1944 was underway.
The Germans left the Château de Vincennes under the same circumstances as the French in 1940, in a hurry.
Half an hour before leaving, the Germans told André Urtré, a kind gesture on their part, that he should evacuate the premises. They had placed explosives in the four corners of the Queen's Pavilion and the King's Pavilion. They were set on a timer, after which they went off. The detonation and the blasts were heard, and a gigantic fire erupted from the two pavilions.
Their military calculations at the time were established. They were going to do the same thing they'd done on the Eastern Front with their famous scorched earth policy. Nothing was to be left at the disposal of the enemy.
The Germans finally did what André Urtré had spent 4 years of occupation trying to prevent at all costs. They destroyed part of the Château de Vincennes.
André Urtré did everything he could to get along with the German administration officer. We have that to thank for the fact that the keep and the Holy Chapel were spared.
Total destruction had been narrowly avoided. But the liberation meant more than the Germans just leaving. New occupying troops arrived, this time the Allies. It was now their turn to discover the French chateaux. But would they behave any better?
After the liberation of Versailles, the scales tipped in the other direction. The Allied troops succeeded the Germans. You now had the American, English, and French military visiting Versailles, and the consequences were just more of the same as in 1940. There was damage and some theft. That's often the case with large military movements in this kind of place.
The artwork was repatriated, sent back to where it had come from, but it would be a long time before the chateaux would recover their former glory. After the liberation, they adopted the same plan they'd put into place at the start, namely to move the art in waves. First pieces went immediately after the end of the war, and the last pieces left in the 1950s.
The collections were gradually returned in 1945 and 1946. It was a long process that was carried out with all necessary precautions.
Everything came back slowly following the end of the war. It wasn't easy because, as you can imagine, asking for trucks and fuel to transport works of art was not everyone's top priority.
There was an almost daily line of trucks that was occasionally interrupted because the trucks broke down or the roads had been bombed, so they had to find alternative routes to get where they needed.
It was quite a triumphant return. It really wasn't a moment too soon to place the statues back on their original pedestals or to hammer in the nails of every valuable canvas, notably on June 15, 1945, when the most famous painting of all the Louvre was returned, the Mona Lisa. After such a long journey for that painting, and under the watchful eye of the Deputy Director of Paintings Conservation, Germain Bazin, he leaned forward and hung the painting up with his hands, which today sounds absolutely mad. One would never dare to actually touch such a masterpiece of French artistic heritage. It was incredibly symbolic to have the Mona Lisa back in the Louvre Museum.
It was August the 26th, 1946, when they reopened the doors of the Château de Versailles to visitors who came as free people. It was a powerful moment for Versailles.
These curators and guardians gave their entire lives, day and night, for 4 years. They were an integral part of the huge resistance movement.
The role played by Jacques Jaujat was so important for the resistance during the occupation that to this day there's a door dedicated to him in the École du Louvre. It's called the Jaujat door.
Hitler dreamed of destroying France's museum so he could open his own in Linz. His project would never see the light of day. The collections stolen by Göring in Europe and in France included the beautiful German woman, would be restored in 1945. And while the Third Reich would crumble, the Louvre, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Vincennes, Chambord, and Versailles all survived the Second World War.